Let's begin with Story 1. The Price of Silk, the Han Dynasty's quiet economic tug-of-war. You are not dreaming. You're lying in bed, listening to a story that begins not with great battles or grand emperors, but with price regulation. And silk. Welcome to the Han Dynasty, specifically, the later period known as the Eastern Han, around the 1st century CE, where one of the most valuable goods in the ancient world became the subject of quiet, persistent tension between bureaucracy and economics. Silk in the Han Dynasty was more than fashion. It was currency, diplomacy, and a tool of social stratification, woven not only into the robes of nobles but into the policies of the state. It moved across deserts, mountains, and eventually empires, reaching as far as Rome. But inside China there was a problem. The price of silk, the people who made it, and the ones who sold it didn't always align with the plans of the state. Let's begin by settling into the soft weave of context. The fabric of empire. Silk was the pride of Han China, developed from earlier dynastic practices and turned into a cornerstone of economic and diplomatic power. Sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, was a craft passed down generations. Peasant women, especially in southern China, often worked tirelessly unraveling cocoons, spinning threads, and weaving fabric. Silk was one of the few goods taxed not just for its trade value, but also for its production. It entered the state economy through tribute and taxation, often paid in bolts of silk instead of coin. In frontier regions, silk served a different function. It was a political tool. The Han state gave silk to non-Han tribes in exchange for peace or loyalty. These were not trivial gifts. Large volumes of silk were transported to the Xiongnu and other Central Asian groups to maintain political balance. In effect, silk was a Cold War currency used to avoid open conflict. And all the while, a quiet but persistent question loomed. How do you control the price of something so valuable, so portable, and so deeply embedded in every layer of society? Markets, middlemen, and state anxiety. By the middle of the 1st century CE, Han officials became increasingly concerned with the unregulated pricing of essential goods including silk, salt, and iron. Market towns sprouted in growing numbers, and local merchants began charging rates far beyond what state officials thought acceptable. The problem wasn't just greed, it was geography. Silk-producing regions were far from many major urban centers. By the time the product reached Luoyang, the capital, it might pass through a dozen hands. Middlemen, Shang merchants, many from hereditary merchant families, flourished. They often hoarded silk, waiting for prices to rise. The Han court, ever wary of non-aristocratic power, began issuing edicts. These edicts weren't always enforced, but they reveal a mindset. Control was slipping, and prices weren't following the harmony Confucian ideology demanded. The economy, like the rivers of China, could not always be tamed by imperial decree. The role of the commandery granaries. To combat inflation and scarcity, the Han state employed an interventionist system known as the equitable marketing system. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Pingjun Fa. Originally developed under the earlier Western Han Chancellor Sang Hengyang, it was revived during periods of economic strain. Here's how it worked. When the price of silk or other essentials rose too high, state agents would flood the market with government-stored goods, aiming to lower prices. Conversely, when prices dipped too low, hurting producers, the state would buy up silk in large quantities to prop up the price. These activities were managed from regional storage facilities known as commandery granaries and overseen by market inspectors. It was, by ancient standards, a remarkably advanced form of market regulation. But it was also immensely expensive and prone to abuse. The paperwork of control. The Han bureaucracy was massive. Reports about silk quantities, pricing, and trade activity flowed from market towns to provincial capitals to the imperial court. Officials were expected to keep ledgers of every purchase, sale, and inventory fluctuation. Some of these records survive. scratched on bamboo slips or inscribed on stone. They show a world mired in paper well, bamboo and silk paper where the price of a single bolt of silk might be tracked across hundreds of miles and months of movement. And yet for all this oversight, regional officials often did as they pleased. Corruption was common. Inspectors were bribed. Prices were falsified. Silk marked for storage was sold on the side. The state believed it was taming the dragon of the market. In reality, it was often just chasing its tail. Peasants and the hidden costs of regulation. While the state struggled to control prices from above, those at the bottom, the sericulturists, especially women, were pressed from both ends. When prices were high, they were accused of greed. When prices were low, they were taxed anyway. Some regions attempted to fix silk prices for purchase by local officials. The result? Smuggling. It became common to trade silk through unofficial channels to gain better returns. Others simply moved, abandoning their villages for freer markets, contributing to internal migration that alarmed Han census keepers. In response, new edicts were passed: curfews for markets, mandatory price ceilings, prohibitions on certain trade routes. The more the state tried to hold the thread, the more it unraveled. Silk and the image of empire. To the world outside, China was the land of silk. Roman writers, including Pliny the Elder, complained that Roman gold was vanishing into the East in exchange for gossamer robes. But few in Rome understood the complexity of that trade. Even fewer could guess that behind the elegant silk were struggling peasant families, unpaid bureaucrats, and ledgers stained with tears and ink. The Han Dynasty wanted to project control, harmony, and heavenly mandate. But the silk trade revealed a crack in the mirror, a quiet economic rebellion playing out not in open war, but in price lists and hidden stalls. A moment of quiet tension. So there we are. The Han state has declared price limits on silk. Merchants find ways around them. Peasants suffer quietly. And somewhere in the city of Luoyang, a tired official sharpens his brush and begins yet another report. This month, the market price of a bolt of standard silk exceeded 200 cash. The cause is unknown. Recommend further investigation. But is it really unknown? Or is it simply a symptom of a deeper problem? What happens when the value of your most precious good slips through your fingers like thread from a fraying robe? When we left off, the Han Dynasty was trying, sometimes desperately, to regulate the price of silk. What began as an effort to stabilize trade and protect peasants was slowly turning into a tangle of failed price controls, backdoor dealings, and economic disillusionment. The silk threads that once stitched an empire together were now winding through a vast web of bureaucracy, local resistance, and imperial confusion. Let's step deeper into this story, not through the grand halls of the imperial court, but into the narrow corridors of administrative offices, dusty storehouses, and the private homes of low-level officials. The place where empire met economy was not a battlefield. It was a ledger. The life of a market inspector. Imagine this. You are Liu Rong, a mid-ranking market inspector in the commandery of Shu, modern-day Sichuan, a prosperous region known for its mulberry trees and skilled weavers. Every morning you rise before dawn, tie your robe, and make your way through the market streets, notebook in hand. Your job sounds simple. Ensure merchants sell silk within the state-sanctioned price range, report hoarding, and inspect warehouses for hidden stockpiles. But nothing is simple in practice. You arrive to find a merchant smiling too much. That usually means something off. You check his stall, bolts of silk marked for military use, somehow in a civilian market. Prices suspiciously consistent across competitors. You know what's happening: price fixing, hoarding, bribery. And now you're faced with a choice: report it, accept a bribe, or look the other way to avoid being reassigned to a remote province. This is the paradox faced by hundreds of Han inspectors. Their roles were defined by law, but shaped by survival. The state demanded vigilance. Reality required compromise. The hidden economy of silk. While the official market operated under government regulation, another world thrived beneath the surface. The Yinchi, Chinese letter, or hidden market. There, prices were driven by demand, not policy. Soldiers stationed far from silk-producing areas were often desperate to buy silk for letters, uniforms, or gifts. Frontier merchants exploited this need, transporting bolts over treacherous terrain, sometimes disguised as food or grain. The profits were enormous. A bolt of silk could be bought for 100 coins in a regulated market, but sold for 400 or 500 in the Northwest Territories near the Qingnu border. This meant that even state officials participated, quietly selling government silk to intermediaries for personal gain. Meanwhile, the empire kept issuing decrees. One edict read, "Let it be known, the price of silk shall remain fixed at 180 cash per standard bolt. No deviation shall be tolerated. Offenders shall face seizure of goods and public flogging." But the edicts echoed like whispers in mountains. Trade went on. Prices rose and fell like the Yellow River in flood season. Silk diplomacy and the strategic surplus. Not all silk was meant for domestic sale. A significant portion was reserved for Hekin, Chinese letter, treaties, marriage alliances, and gift exchanges with nomadic powers. When a Han princess was married off to a Qingnu leader, she brought dowries of silk, horses, and fine goods. Beyond marriages, silk was used to buy peace. Every year, convoys carried tens of thousands of bolts to foreign rulers. This wasn't generosity, it was strategy. Maintaining these diplomatic stocks was a logistical nightmare. Silk had to be stored, guarded, and protected from spoilage. The slightest miscalculation, a rat infestation, a leaky roof could threaten treaty obligations. And because so much silk was diverted to foreign diplomacy, less was available for sale inside China. This further tightened the domestic market, raising demand. In other words, the very tool used to keep peace abroad was fraying peace at home. The burden of equitable marketing. The Han Dynasty's system of Pingjunfa equitable marketing was theoretically brilliant, but like many centralized systems, it relied on perfect execution. And in the vastness of Han China spanning deserts, rivers, mountains, and ethnic frontiers, perfection was rare. Let's walk through a typical cycle. A price spike is reported in a provincial capital. Silk is selling for 250 cash, far above the ceiling. The central government dispatches funds to the region's administrator, instructing him to buy silk from weavers at a fixed price. Silk is purchased, stored in granaries, and re-released into the market in small quantities to drive prices down. Reports are filed, funds are tallied, and a dozen officials send ledgers back to Luoyang. Now let's see what usually happened. The initial report is delayed by weeks due to flooding or bandit activity. Funds are misused or partially embezzled. The silk collected is often of poor quality or already promised to military suppliers. When finally sold, the surplus silk floods the market, crashing prices and bankrupting small traders. In short, the system was a loop of intended stability, followed by unintended chaos. When laws meet lives, the silk weaver's perspective. Consider May, a fictional but historically grounded figure, a widow in the southern region of Chu. She raises silkworms, tends mulberry trees, and weaves silk to feed her 2 children. Every year, she owes a portion of her silk to the government as tax. This is not negotiable, but when she brings her remaining bolts to market, she finds the prices suppressed. Inspectors demand she sell for 180 coins when private merchants offer 300, but only if she agrees to an under-the-table deal. She can sell to the government and make little profit, break the law and face punishment, smuggle her silk to a different region and risk theft. None of these choices are good, and yet she survives, as many did, by navigating this narrow road of compromise and caution. The Han economy, in many ways, rested on the backs of such women unrecorded, overworked, and underpaid. Luoyang's silence, imperial apathy or strategic inaction. As reports of price manipulation and smuggling reached Luoyang, one might expect swift action, but the capital often moved slowly, if at all. Why? Because economic instability did not always mean political instability. The emperor and his court were more concerned with rebellion, invasion, and legitimacy. Silk, in this view, was only a concern if it threatened the tax base or diplomatic relationships. Besides, the elite wore silk regardless of cost. Their robes came from palace workshops, not market stalls. To many in the court, market fluctuations were a problem for bureaucrats to solve, not emperors to worry about. And so a strange quiet fell over the center of power. Even as provincial unrest simmered, Luoyang remained focused on rituals, succession, and celestial portents. It was said that the empire is vast, and the emperor sees only stars. Perhaps in that silence, the roots of future instability took hold. An economic paradox unfolds. By the end of the Eastern Han period, the silk economy had become a paradox. It was both tightly regulated and widely corrupted. It sustained both the state and its enemies. It was both a symbol of stability and a cause of unrest. In later dynasties, including the Tang and Song, efforts to control trade would evolve. Silk would remain vital, but its price would no longer be micromanaged in quite the same way. The Han experiment in price control left a mixed legacy. Some praised its ambition, others mocked its futility. But what remains most fascinating is not whether the policy succeeded or failed, but how ordinary people survived through it all. They adapted, they maneuvered, they endured. A question lingers in the loom. So we are left with a story not of war or revolution, but of persistence and quiet defiance. The Han Dynasty tried to manage the economy with scrolls and edicts. Merchants learned to work around them. Peasants bore the weight of both law and lawlessness. And somewhere in the middle, the price of silk continued to move not by mandate, but by need. So now we ask, was the failure of Han silk regulation a flaw in the system, or a reflection of a deeper truth that the market, like silk, is always in motion, no matter how tightly it's bound? In the fatting years of the Han Dynasty, as corruption intensified and central control frayed, the threadbare state of silk price regulation became a symbol of larger dysfunction. A once grand system designed to manage trade, sustain diplomacy, and protect its citizens was unraveling. But the story of Han silk price regulation didn't end with a single dramatic collapse. It dissolved slowly, almost imperceptibly, lost in the murmur of bureaucracy and the shuffle of weary feet in market squares. Let's draw the final threads of this narrative together. The limits of centralization. The Han administration had, for over 2 centuries, attempted to reconcile Confucian ideals with legalist methods. In silk policy, this translated into moralized economic control, attempting to guide prices with laws, edicts, and bureaucratic surveillance. The government believed that virtue and order could harmonize commerce, that prices should reflect fairness rather than profit. But centralization has a limit. By the 2nd century CE, the Han state was overextended. Tax revenues dwindled due to corruption and administrative decay. Entire regions fell out of regular contact with Luoyang. Silk convoys sent to frontier commanderies often went missing or were intercepted by bandits. Officials, once terrified of imperial reprimand, grew bolder in their defiance. Market inspectors became complicit in price-fixing schemes. Governors ignored central price caps in favor of local interests. The regulation of silk prices, like the regulation of salt, iron, and grain, quietly collapsed, not through revolt or fire, but through inertia. The machinery of governance still turned, but the wheels no longer met the ground. Economic consequences: local winners, imperial losers. With the fatting of state controls, regional markets flourished in their own decentralized ways. In wealthy commanderies such as Nanyang or Chengdu, silk producers began forming informal guilds. These weren't official institutions. Guilds wouldn't be formalized until much later dynasties, but they represented collective action. Local weavers set their own prices. Merchants negotiated directly with artisans. Private wealth accumulated. This redistribution of economic power brought short-term benefits to producers, but long-term problems for the empire. Why? Because the Han relied on fixed silk prices, not just to control inflation, but to fund the empire. When prices rose unpredictably, it undermined military procurement. The army, which received uniforms, tents, and armor wrappings in silk, found itself paying more for less. Silk tribute, once sent reliably to the Xiongnu and other border groups, became inconsistent. Diplomats were sometimes forced to offer lesser gifts, offending tribal leaders accustomed to tribute of a certain quality. The imperial image of reliability cracked. And with that crack came geopolitical consequences. Diplomatic fallout: the Silk Road chokes. The Han Dynasty's foreign policy had long revolved around soft power bribery disguised as diplomacy, sustained through gifts of silk. But as internal production fragmented and prices soared, the empire found itself unable to maintain the steady stream of bolts required to keep regional peace. By the reign of Emperor Ling, R. 168-189 CE, reports emerged of discontent among Central Asian tribes. Envoys from the Wusun and other steppe peoples returned to their homelands with fewer bolts, or with silk of inferior weave. In some cases, what was supposed to be imperial silk bore the mark of private workshops, evidence that officials were outsourcing gifts just to fulfill quotas. Trust began to erode. Some tribes began to renegotiate or abandon treaties. Trade routes grew more dangerous. Silk shipments were ambushed not just by bandits but by former allies. The famed Silk Road, though not yet a unified route, became more perilous, less profitable, and deeply entangled in the domestic instability of the Han. Internal disintegration: silk and the seeds of rebellion. While foreign relations strained under the weight of unreliable tribute, discontent simmered at home. The average silk weaver, often female, still toiled under tax burdens even as the value of her product soared in free markets. In some regions, silk taxes were increased not to enrich the state, but to fill the coffers of local lords. These self-interested elites, emboldened by imperial weakness, used tax collectors as private agents. Peasants were forced to surrender silk at undervalued rates or pay in coin they didn't have. Defaults were punished with land seizures. This economic exploitation contributed to the growing unrest that would explode in 184 CE with the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Though the rebellion had spiritual and political roots, economic suffering, especially among rural families, fueled its expansion. Silk regulation wasn't the sole cause, but it was part of the problem. And the empire, already bleeding from internal rot, lacked the strength to respond effectively. From control to collapse, a bureaucratic epilogue. In the aftermath of the rebellion, as warlords carved up the empire and the Han Dynasty lurched toward its fall, silk policy became a relic. The once detailed ledgers of market inspectors were abandoned in shuttered offices. Silk warehouses stood looted or empty. Later dynasties, such as the Wei and Jin, would inherit a broken economic model. Some lessons were learned, others ignored. But the notion of strict state control over silk prices would never again dominate policy with the intensity seen under the Han. The thread had snapped. Legacy, lessons from the loom. And yet, even in failure, the Han silk regulation experiment left a mark. Administrative sophistication. The Han bureaucracy, despite its flaws, demonstrated a remarkable ability to document, organize, and attempt large-scale economic control. It showed what was possible and what was dangerous when moral ideology was applied to complex markets. Recognition of market forces. Future Chinese governments, notably during the Tang and Song periods, shifted toward policies that acknowledged supply and demand. While some regulation remained, there was a greater willingness to allow localized pricing and to focus on quality control rather than rigid price ceilings. Human resilience. Most enduring of all was the example set by silk workers and merchants. Despite changing laws, shifting regimes, and economic instability, they endured. They adapted to black markets, weathered tax hikes, and passed their skills down through generations. Silk never disappeared. Control over it did. A quiet parallel with the present. As you lie here listening, perhaps you're reminded subtly of more modern echoes. Today, governments around the world still attempt to regulate prices, curb inflation, manage trade. And still, the friction between policy and practice remains. Supply chains falter, markets shift beyond control, laws are written, then broken, paper trails are followed into dead ends. Perhaps then, the story of Han Silk is not a dusty tale, but a living mirror. What happens when a state confuses control with stability? And can an economy be managed by will alone? Or must it be understood as something far more human, fragile, adaptive, and always slightly out of reach? Thus ends Story 1, The Price of Silk, the Han Dynasty's quiet economic tug-of-war. A story not of armies, but of accounting. Not of emperors, but of embattled weavers. And not of conquest, but of collapse woven quietly into the very fabric of an empire. You open your eyes in the Roman Empire, not on the steps of the Senate, not at the edge of a battlefield, but in a dusty counting room in a port warehouse in Ostia. It smells faintly of olives and ink. Outside, the Mediterranean sun beats down on hundreds of clay amphorae stacked in tight rows, each carefully marked with stamps and scribbles. Inside, a scribe counts records and frowns. Welcome to the world of Roman olive oil, not the world of flavor and cuisine, but of logistics, tax ledgers, and quiet corruption. This is not an empire of marble, but of paperwork. Let's begin. A commodity worth counting. The Roman Empire ran on grain, wine, and oil. While grain fed the masses and wine accompanied every meal, olive oil lubricated the body of the empire literally and economically. It was used in food preparation, lighting, medicine, cosmetics, religious rituals, and most notably, public bathing. The demand was vast and unrelenting. A Roman citizen might consume dozens of liters a year, and the empire housed tens of millions. Feeding this need required not only cultivation, but an enormous bureaucratic infrastructure that moved oil from the rural estates of Hispania and Africa proconsularis to the hungry mouths and oily limbs of Rome. It was not only about trade, it was about tax, and nothing taxes an empire like the attempt to manage something as fluid as oil. The annona, a bureaucratic belly. To understand the olive oil economy, you must understand the annona system. Originally created to manage grain supply for Rome's population, it was expanded under the emperors to include oil, wine, and pork. The annona was more than a supply chain, it was a welfare apparatus. Certain citizens, particularly in Rome, received state-supplied rations of these goods, delivered regularly and without cost. By the 2nd century CE, olive oil became part of the free distributions. The empire did not just import oil, it controlled it, stored it, and gave it away. But how do you give away something that must be transported across seas, stored in massive warehouses, and ladled into containers without modern pumps? Very, very slowly, and often very corruptly. From Hispania Baetica to Ostia, the oil highway. The province of Hispania Baetica, southern Spain, was the olive oil capital of the empire. The region's climate, labor force, including enslaved workers, and access to river routes made it ideal for mass production. Landowners filled thousands of amphorae two-handled clay jars with oil and sent them downstream toward the port of Gad's, modern Cadiz. There, oil was loaded onto large merchant ships bound for Ostia, Rome's primary port. Upon arrival in Ostia, the amphorae were inspected, offloaded, and recorded. The oil was then transferred sometimes via canal, sometimes overland into Rome's Horia Olearia, or oil warehouses. Simple in theory. In practice, an ordeal. Clay stamps and shipping slips. Each amphora bore a titulus pictus, a painted or inscribed label with essential details. Producer name, origin estate, inspector's seal, volume, year, contents olive oil, sometimes mixed with other ingredients. These stamps acted like a passport and a tax form rolled into one. Every oil shipment was tracked meticulously, but tracking did not mean transparency. Here, where things began to slide. Where the bribes begin. A ship arrives in Ostia. The dock is crowded. Officials inspect the cargo, at least they're supposed to. But Lucius, the state-appointed oil inspector, is already 3 amphorae behind and sweating under the sun. A merchant from Baetica approaches. He knows Lucius. A wink, a coin slipped under a wax seal, and Lucius glances past a cracked amphora. It shouldn't pass inspection, but now it will. Multiply this by hundreds of ships. The result: oil counted that didn't exist. Spoiled oil marked as fresh. Amphorae lost during unloading, only to reappear in private markets. And the emperor's oil distribution program. It went on, quietly bleeding money. A system of quotas and quiet deals. The imperial government set quotas for provinces like Baetica, send X amount of oil to Rome. These quotas were often tied to taxes. Instead of paying in coin, estates paid in goods: olive oil, grain, wine. But not all estates were equal. Wealthy landowners could afford to meet quotas easily. Smaller ones struggled. Corrupt officials might adjust quotas in exchange for payment or favors. Over time, a shadow economy developed around quota arbitrage. Some merchants specialized in buying extra oil from large estates and transferring it, on paper, to small estates to help them meet their obligations. These middlemen profited from paperwork manipulation, not oil itself. Amphorae as archaeology's ledger. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover mountains of discarded amphorae at Monte Testaccio, a man-made hill in Rome composed almost entirely of broken oil jars, most from Baetica. Why were they broken? Because reusing state-issued amphorae was illegal to prevent fraud. Once emptied, jars were smashed and discarded to avoid being refilled with lower-quality oil or used for private sales pretending to be state-supplied goods. Monte Testaccio is a garbage heap, yes, but it's also a record of bureaucracy. Every shard carries stamps, seals, and dates. The hill is silent, but it tells a story of commerce, control, and unintended waste. The human cost of the oil trade. Behind every amphora was labor. Enslaved workers harvesting olives, pressing pulp, and filling jars. Sailors navigating unpredictable seas. Porters hauling amphorae on their backs. Scribes who spent careers copying numbers into ledgers that no longer exist. For most of these people, the oil trade was not abstract. It was exhaustion, injury, and long hours. Bribes and bureaucracy weren't theoretical, they were survival strategies. Even Roman citizens who benefited from oil distributions did not always see stability. Delays, shortages, and spoilage meant going without. Riots were not uncommon when promised rations failed to arrive. Emperors and the illusion of control. Emperors such as Hadrian and Antoninus Pius issued reforms, increased oversight of inspectors, created new offices like the Praefectus Annani to centralize control, improved warehouse infrastructure. But the core issue remained: an empire too large, a system too complex, and too many people with incentive to cheat. And yet the system endured for centuries. Why? Because despite inefficiencies and corruption, enough oil got through. The tension in every barrel. So we arrive at a moment of stillness. A ship waits offshore, its barrels shifting in the tide. A clerk tallies numbers in fatting ink. A senator bathes in a public bathhouse, unaware of how many bribes and broken laws went into the oil massaged into his back. And you, lying in bed, may now be wondering, did the Roman Empire survive despite its bureaucracy or because of it? And, if the oil kept flowing, did the corruption really matter? When last we left the Roman oil trade, corruption was a quiet constant. Ships were groaning with cargo, and bureaucrats were scribbling numbers faster than they could verify them. Yet somehow, the system worked just well enough. Rome's baths stayed slick, its lamps stayed lit, and its citizens continued to receive their rationed oil, courtesy of an empire built on amphory and administrative improvisation. Now we descend further into the maze, from docks and quotas to the inner workings of Roman storage, distribution, and oversight. We'll look more closely at how the olive oil moved through the arteries of the Roman capital, and at the flawed mechanisms that kept it from collapsing altogether. The Horia Olearia, Rome's oil reservoirs. If Ostia was the empire's stomach, the Horia Olearia, the oil warehouses of Rome, were its intestines. Built under Augustus and expanded by subsequent emperors, these Horia storehouses lined the Tiber River. They were vast, echoing buildings, segmented into hundreds of rooms where amphorae were stacked carefully by content, date, and source. Oil stored here was intended for public use rations, bathhouses, temples, and was guarded and catalogued by a rotating staff of clerks, warehouse keepers, horiae, and imperial inspectors. The records were precise in intent, but often imprecise in practice. Amphorae cracked, rodents made nests in corners, lamps and torches were prohibited inside for obvious reasons, but fires still happened, sometimes suspiciously, especially when amphorae of poor quality oil had been misreported as top grade. Loss was inevitable, but losses could be minimized or hidden depending on who was on shift. The clerks of the capital, unseen and underpaid. Behind the oil trade's flow were clerks who lived in rented rooms, wore second-hand togas, and spent years transcribing inventory from wax tablets to scrolls. A typical workday might involve recording deliveries, comparing weight tallies, resealing amphorae, filing damage reports, sending complaints to regional officials. They were rarely celebrated and frequently blamed when things went wrong. They operated in a gray area, above the laborers, below the elite, and vulnerable to both. As one satirical Roman writer put it, the emperor dines on imported oil, the merchant on spilled drops, and the scribe on hope. Clerks learned survival strategies. Some borrowed oil and returned it later. Others formed relationships with favored merchants, offering to waive reports in exchange for coins or gifts. This wasn't open theft, it was simply how the system worked. The public distribution system, oil as welfare. Every month, thousands of Roman citizens lined up to receive their rations. The fermentations, grain distributions, were the most famous, but Olation's oil distributions were equally vital. Eligibility depended on citizenship, residence, and registration in the public records. Once verified, citizens would receive measured amounts of oil, often in ceramic vessels or small amphorae brought from home. The volume varied over time and by decree, but the symbolism was constant. Rome provided. This system helped maintain loyalty among the urban poor. The emperor was seen not just as a ruler, but as a patron, fulfilling the role of a father to the people. Oil was not just a commodity, it was a promise. But promises are expensive, and when imperial coffers ran low, corners were cut. Spoilage, substitution, and strategic deception. When proper oil could not be sourced due to shipping delays, bad harvests, or corruption, warehouse officials sometimes diluted rations or substituted older oil with misleading labeling. There are records, mostly scattered legal inscriptions, and complaints preserved in literary texts of rancid oil being labeled as fresh, lamp oil being issued for cooking, a potential health hazard, partial rations given to citizens with vague explanations, barrels topped with good oil, but filled mostly with lower-grade stock. Public complaints did occur, especially in Rome, where literacy and political awareness were relatively high among citizens. But consequences were rare unless scandals grew too visible. And so the game continued. Oil privilege and the imperial court. While the general populace received rations, Rome's elite enjoyed oil of a very different sort. Estate managers working for senatorial families competed to send the rarest, most aromatic, most precisely pressed oils to noble houses. There were rumors of scented olive oils infused with herbs or flowers, single-press estate oils used for temple offerings or imperial feasts, oil tastings where wealthy Romans compared flavor, clarity, and thickness. The imperial court maintained a private reserve of oil, much of it never entering the public Horea system. Some of this came from imperial estates, some was diverted quietly from the official supply chain. This created two oil economies, one for the people, one for the powerful, and everyone working within the system knew it. Regulation and the law, the lex fermentaria model. Roman emperors issued legal frameworks to standardize the flow of essential goods. The lex fermentaria laws originally for grain were adapted in form to olive oil. These laws established standard weights for amphorae, requirements for state inspection, penalties for underfilled jars, monthly reporting requirements for warehouse managers. The problem: enforcement. The empire was massive. Inspectors were few. Legal threats often relied on the goodwill of local governors who had their own concerns. By the late 2nd century CE, the Emperor Commodus issued a dramatic, if theatrical, decree. Let the man who tampers with the oil of the people be cast into the Tiber, bound in his own amphora. A powerful image, but as always more symbolic than practical. Regional tensions and the price of oil. As the capital consumed vast quantities of oil, tensions arose in the provinces. Farmers and small traders in Baetica, Africa, and parts of Sicily resented the heavy extraction of goods, sometimes at fixed prices below market value. This led to declining investment in long-distance trade, secret local sales in defiance of quotas, abandonment of olive orchards in favor of other crops, growing tension between rural producers and urban consumers. Some historians argue that these pressures were early indicators of the empire's shifting economic center away from Rome and toward Constantinople and the East. The western half was not collapsing, but the ground was becoming unstable. The Mediterranean mirror, was it all worth it? As you drift here through the dusty records and cracked amphorae, you might ask, was it worth it? Did the empire gain more from regulating olive oil than it lost? Perhaps the answer lies in this. Despite all the inefficiency, all the bribes, all the human error, the oil still arrived. Not always on time, not always fresh, not always legal. But it arrived. And for hundreds of years, Romans lived, bathed, cooked, and worshipped in a world lit and lubricated by the oily residue of bureaucratic ambition. A drop of doubt, And yet, as the sun sets over Ostia's warehouses, as another amphora cracks under its own weight, we are left with a question. Did Rome manage to control its oil trade, or did it simply learn to tolerate its failures? And if the system can survive on inefficiency and corruption, what exactly does that say about the strength or fragility of empire? As the 2nd century turned into the 3rd, the great olive oil apparatus of the Roman Empire, so vast, so intricate, so weighed down by corruption, began to show signs of irreversible strain. The bribes continued, the ledgers grew heavier, but something had changed. The oil still arrived, but not always where it was needed. The paperwork still flowed, but often without purpose. The system, like many imperial institutions, had grown too large to reform and too fragile to endure unchanged. Let us now explore the final phase of this story. Not a sudden fall, but a slow leakage, one amphora at a time. A river of oil meets a sea of crisis. By the late 3rd century CE, Rome's economy had entered a period of extreme volatility. Known as the crisis of the 3rd century, this era saw rapid turnover of emperors, dozens in 50 years, civil wars across the provinces, invasions by Germanic and Persian forces, coin debasement and rampant inflation, urban decline, especially in the western half of the empire. Olive oil, once a symbol of Roman abundance and social cohesion, became a casualty of this deeper systemic unraveling. Merchants no longer trusted state payments. Farmers abandoned olive groves due to labor shortages, invasions, or lack of reliable markets. The once routine shipments from Baetica dwindled. More oil now came from North Africa, where imperial control was stronger and corruption more manageable for a time. But even Africa could not fully supply a system now buckling under the weight of its own paperwork. The quiet collapse of the Annona. The Annona, the state's massive food and oil distribution program, still existed, but in increasingly distorted form. As Roman coinage lost value, the state relied more on requisitioning goods directly from provinces. This was often labeled as in-kind tax, but in practice, it resembled confiscation. Estate owners complied reluctantly. Many underreported harvests, hid stockpiles, or bribed transport officials to redirect oil to private buyers. The bureaucratic chain, once precise, if slow, became mudded. Ledgers were faked. Oil was rerouted before inspection. Imperial warehouses in Rome often stood half-empty, their inventory logs written in hopeful fiction. The people noticed. Citizens once loyal to the empire's provisioning system found themselves standing in ration lines that ended in shrugs. Monte Testaccio, a hill of shattered promises. We return now to Monte Testaccio, that strange artificial hill in Rome made from broken amphorae. By the 4th century, its growth had slowed. New layers of amphorae bore signs of lesser quality and different origins. Baedecan jars became rare. African ones dominated. Archaeologists studying the site centuries later found that earlier layers showed consistent documentation. Later layers revealed rushed inscriptions, missing stamps, and mismatched dates. Some amphorae were never even sealed, suggesting bypassing of standard inspection processes. Monte Testaccio had become a physical record of decline in standards not abrupt, but gradual. Each broken jar marked a moment where someone decided that oversight no longer mattered. It is, in many ways, the most boring and profound ruin in Rome. Adaptation and the Eastern shift. As the western half of the empire faltered, the East, centered on Constantinople, began to reorganize imperial provisioning. There, in the new capital, oil was still vital but managed under tighter, more localized systems. Smaller, regional storehouses replaced massive networks. Trade shifted from grand trans-Mediterranean routes to local circuits. New legal codes like those of Emperor Diocletian attempted to fix prices and crack down on corruption, but often met the same fate as their predecessors. Still, in the East, the imperial image was preserved longer. The provisioning of Constantinople continued into the Byzantine period. The mistakes of Rome had not been forgotten, but they had also not been fully avoided. The afterlife of Amphory. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, the great oil bureaucracy died quietly. No decree announced its end. It simply stopped being recorded. But the amphory remained. They were used as construction material, crushed into roads, ground into pozzolana cement, in some cases used in graves or turned into flower pots. Roman bureaucracy had produced so much durable waste that it lingered centuries after the paper records crumbled. And even today, you can walk in Rome or Seville and find traces fragments of stamped clay, lying in museum drawers or tucked into walls. Each one a whisper of a shipment, a bribe, a tax, or a miscounted barrel of oil. The human scale, a final glimpse. We end not with emperors or laws, but with a scene so common it was rarely written down. A sailor unloads an amphora under a lowering sun. A scribe sits on a barrel, rubbing his temples, staring at a column of figures that no longer make sense. A widow, holding her clay ration vessel, asks why her oil is cloudy this month. No answer is given. But still, life continues. The bathhouses grow colder. The lamps dim. The empire flickers on, lit by the residue of its systems, long after their purpose has faded. Reflections in oil. As you rest now, lulled by the quiet weight of Roman logistics, you might wonder, was Rome's olive oil system a marvel of statecraft, or a warning about the limits of central control? And more curiously, if the bureaucracy failed, yet the oil still flowed, what does that teach us about how systems survive not through perfection, but through persistence? Even bribes, after all, require structure. And perhaps the real empire was not the Senate or the sword, but the forms, the jars, and the people who knew how to make them move. Story 3. The ink tax revolt when writing got expensive in 18th century Britain. You are sitting at a wooden desk, a candle flickering beside you, dipping a goose feather quill into thick, iron gall ink. You're about to write a letter, a request to a distant cousin for a modest loan, but before you put pen to parchment, you pause. Because the ink was taxed. The paper was taxed. The wax seal to close the envelope, also taxed. It's the mid-18th century in Britain, and something as simple as the act of writing has become a financial decision. This is the story of the forgotten tax revolt that didn't involve muskets or mobs, but printers, poets, bureaucrats, and barrel makers. It's the story of how writing, mundane, clerical, and quiet, became a battleground in the economics of empire. The setting, a bureaucrat's Britain. The 18th century was an age of empires, but also of receipts. Following the War of the Spanish Succession and leading into conflicts like the 7 Years' War, Britain found itself in constant need of funds. Wars were expensive. Maintaining overseas colonies was expensive. And building a modern state complete with roads, courthouses, and navy yards required a regular source of income. Enter the excise office, a growing bureaucratic organism tasked with taxing the day-to-day. And among its least glamorous but most lucrative duties, the taxation of writing materials. Ink as revenue, a small tax with a big reach. In 1745, the British government imposed a duty on writing ink. It wasn't the first time, but it was part of a growing trend, taxing consumables not for moral or luxury reasons, but simply because people couldn't avoid them. The tax was levied not at the point of sale, but during manufacture. Ink producers were required to register, report production volumes, and pay based on output weight. Inspectors were appointed. Barrels were stamped. Violations could result in fines, imprisonment, or loss of license. On tax paper, the logic was clear. Ink was used in every commercial transaction. It was consumed in legal contracts, ship logs, bank ledgers, and parliamentary records. It was small enough that most people would grumble, but comply. But the impact was much broader than expected. The unseen consequences. Most ink at the time was made using a standard recipe: tannic acid from oak galls, iron sulfate, gum arabic, and water. It was boiled, strained, and stored in barrels or ceramic jars. Ink makers, many of them small craftsmen, suddenly found themselves under strict regulation. Problems emerged quickly. Administrative overhead. Producers had to submit regular reports detailing volumes, recipes, and sales figures. Bribery and false reporting. Some ink makers paid local inspectors to look the other way. Others reduced batch sizes or altered records. Black market ink. Especially in rural areas, ink was sold under the table, sometimes weaker or chemically unstable, leading to faded or corroded documents. Consumer frustration. The price of ink rose, especially in poorer towns. Writers reused pages. Schoolmasters watered down their ink. Legal offices imposed writing fees to cover rising costs. In an ironic twist, taxation meant more bad handwriting, as ink quality declined and pen nibs were overused. The stamp duty, a companion burden. The ink tax didn't exist in isolation. It was one part of a trio of fiscal pressures. Ink duty. Paper tax, dating to 1690, increased several times in the 1700s. Stamp duty, first introduced in 1694 and dramatically expanded during the century. Stamp duty required many official documents, contracts, deeds, newspapers to be printed on specially watermarked paper showing tax had been paid. Without it, a document could be declared legally invalid. This meant that taxes dictated not just how people wrote, but what was considered real. And the result was growing resentment, particularly among two groups: printers and the literate poor. Printers and pamphleteers pushed back. Printers had long been agents of rebellion. From the radical pamphlets of the English Civil War to anti-Jacobite tracts, they thrived in the gray zones of legality. Now, the ink tax and associated duties were hitting their margins. Smaller print shops struggled. Some shut down. Others began running ghost presses at night, using untaxed ink and unregistered paper to print broadsides, radical essays, and satirical ballads. One underground pamphlet from the 1750s mocked the tax collectors. "With every blot I pay the crown, though not a word I write for king. They tax my thoughts ere they are known, and bid my quill no longer sing." Poetic exaggeration, yes, but also a real reflection of a growing cultural fatigue with bureaucratic interference in the most ordinary acts. Clerks and copyists, the invisible workforce. Perhaps no one felt the squeeze more than the legions of clerks, men, and some women, who filled Britain's ledgers with law, finance, and correspondence. Clerks were not rich. They were, at best, lower middle class, educated, but unremarkable in status. They relied on steady ink, affordable paper, and well-lit desks. With rising costs, many found themselves expected to supply their own materials or deduct expenses from their meager salaries. Court clerks complained of deteriorating ink causing smudged transcripts. Banks delayed ledger updates due to shortages. In some towns, municipal councils debated whether to cut correspondence altogether to save money. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It became a slowdown in the machinery of the state. Resistance without revolution. Unlike other tax protests such as the later American Stamp Act resistance, there was no riot, no dramatic bonfire of tax papers. Instead, the pushback came in quieter forms. petitions from ink makers and stationers requesting reduced duties, letters to newspapers complaining about the burdens on literacy and learning, satirical plays and poems, usually performed in pubs or private clubs, avoidance and noncompliance, especially outside of London. A particularly poignant protest came from a group of schoolmasters in Yorkshire who wrote, "We, the humble instructors of youth, find our ink pots dry, our paper rationed, and our patience taxed. Shall the state charge us by the stroke and bill us for every lesson written?" No formal movement emerged, but Parliament took notice. A gradual repeal, a lasting lesson. Over the next several decades, the ink duty was adjusted, then repealed quietly in the early 19th century, along with reductions in the paper and stamp taxes. The repeal wasn't celebrated. There were no parades, only a slight dip in ink prices and a sigh of relief among stationers. But the episode left a lasting impression. That taxation, however minor, can ripple across culture, education, and even language. That the instruments of writing, ink and paper, are not just tools, but gateways to participation in public life. That economic pressure can silence voices not with censorship, but with cost. A final dip of the pen. Now, as you rest, picture a dimly lit office in 1755. A clerk, bent over his parchment, notices the ink in his well is almost gone. He hesitates. He has 2 more letters to copy and only a few drops left. He considers asking for more, but knows it will be deducted from his weekly wage. So instead, he dips the nib, stretches the ink across a line, and lets it run thin. And in that fatting stroke, you glimpse an entire system overburdened, overtaxed, and quietly resisting. Was it really just about ink? Or was it about the cost of being heard? We return to the desk. The candle is shorter now. The clerk's hand aches. The ink in his pot is darker, thanks to extra gall added in haste. Outside, rain dampens the cobbled streets of London. Inside, the work continues. Because it must. But behind every blot and ledger line is a quiet frustration, the cumulative pressure of taxation on writing materials. A burden that never quite triggered a full revolt, but instead eroded trust, slowed institutions, and stirred a silent defiance. We move deeper into the world affected by the ink tax, not just producers and printers, but the bureaucrats, educators, and intellectuals whose livelihoods depended on writing, copying, reading, and recording. The growth of the papered state. The 18th century marked the transition from a government of noble patronage to one of paperwork. The British state expanded its influence not by marching soldiers across its towns, but by producing forms, contracts, petitions, receipts, and notices. And those documents, thousands produced daily, depended on ink. As the government taxed it and the paper it was written on, it essentially monetized its own growth. With every new department, law, or registry came more writing and more revenue. But this introduced a problem. The state was taxing its own functionality. Imagine courthouses rationing ink and delaying trials. Tax offices misrecording figures due to poor quality writing materials. Postal stations denying service because recipients couldn't pay the stamp duty. The system choked on itself, not in dramatic collapse, but in daily inefficiencies that compounded across a kingdom. Ink and the Empire, colonial repercussions. Though this story centers on Britain, its effects rippled across the Atlantic and into the colonies. Most famously, the Stamp Act of 1765 attempted to impose similar duties on legal documents, newspapers, and licenses in British America. This law required colonists to use specially stamped paper for official business, similar to the tax materials in Britain. But what's often overlooked is that it also indirectly revived anxieties about ink, paper, and the freedom to write. Printers and lawyers in Boston and Philadelphia feared that every word they published would come with a hidden cost. Writing became a political act. So did buying ink. The colonial backlash protests, boycotts, and eventually violence wasn't just about representation. It was about the cost of communication itself. This resistance would outpace and overshadow the quieter grumblings back in Britain, but both shared a root cause: the bureaucratization of literacy. The scholars complained. Within Britain, academics and authors also suffered. Universities, already strapped for funding, saw the cost of materials for students rise. Professors petitioned Parliament, citing hardship among pupils who could no longer afford proper notebooks or examination books. Writers, too, took notice. Samuel Johnson, known for his moral essays and his monumental dictionary, never wrote specifically about the ink tax, but his writings on government and poverty hinted at sympathy for the pains of the penman. In a quiet moment in his idler essays, Johnson noted, "The tools of thought should never be weighed by the scales of excise." It was a subtle jab, but in intellectual circles, it was understood. Writers, poets, clerks, teachers all were increasingly aware that every letter written cost more than it used to. The clerk as symbol of resistance. By the mid-1700s, the figure of the overworked, underpaid, and overly taxed clerk became both a real social problem and a subject of satire. In period cartoons, clerks were drawn with oversized quills, hunched backs, and ink-stained sleeves, symbols of both the expanding state and the petty indignities of its laborers. In one pamphlet, titled "The Grievances of the Scrivener," a fictional narrator lists his daily expenses. Paper taxed, ink taxed, wax taxed, time unpaid, thanks none. Clerks formed quiet alliances. They shared ink. They reused scrap paper. Some began forging receipts for ink taxes they never paid, creating an underground economy of falsified fiscal compliance. Their rebellion was not in protest banners, but in altered ledgers, ignored mandates, and quiet sarcasm passed in candlelit offices. Ink shortages and everyday life. As ink became more expensive and erratic in quality, everyday life began to fray around the edges. Wedding registries sometimes featured thumbprints instead of signatures. Apprentice contracts were delayed as masters waited to afford official documents. School attendance records were minimized or coded in symbols to save ink. Women's letters, often less formal than men's, were written crosswise on reused sheets, writing in one direction, then turning the page and writing perpendicular to conserve space and material. This shift wasn't always noticed at the time, but modern historians studying personal letters from the period often observe changes in penmanship, ink color, and paper reusability around the peak years of writing material taxation. People adapted, but the result was a subtler, less confident culture of writing. The rise of ink alternatives and homemade recipes. In response to rising prices and decreasing quality from official manufacturers, many people turned to homemade ink. Recipes passed between households and were published in periodicals like the Gentleman's Magazine. A typical recipe included oak galls boiled to extract tannin, rusted nails or iron filings for iron sulfate, rainwater, gum arabic to stabilize, wine or vinegar to preserve. These homemade brews were unpredictable. Some worked well, others faded or corroded the paper over time. Still, they provided a quiet form of resistance, a refusal to pay a tax by making do. And so, from kitchen pots and fireplace cauldrons, ink emerged as an act of defiance as much as communication. Parliament notices the grumbling. By the late 1700s, a confluence of voices, printers, teachers, manufacturers, bureaucrats began to sway public opinion. While the government valued the ink tax's steady revenue, it could not ignore the growing inefficiency. Reports reached the Treasury of delays in court filings, fraudulent ink tax receipts, school closures in rural areas citing paper and ink costs, smuggling of untaxed writing supplies from Ireland and the continent. The cost of enforcement, it seemed, was approaching or exceeding the tax's revenue. It wasn't morality or rebellion that prompted reconsideration, it was spreadsheet logic. And behind closed doors, members of Parliament began to whisper. Was it time to loosen the grip? An unfinished sentence. This is not yet the end of the story. But we leave section 2 with the sense of a society under quiet strain, ink-stained, ledger-bound, and growing weary of silence. The revolt against the ink tax was not a blaze but a slow burn. Its heroes were not generals but scribes. Its battleground was not a field but a desk. And as the century closed, one question remained. Can a nation build its empire on paper while taxing every word it writes? The ink has faded. The tax still exists for now, but the resistance is no longer in homemade recipes or satirical pamphlets. It's become something else, a cultural fatigue, a quiet expectation that even thought and expression can carry a fiscal burden. This is how many stories of boring history end not with revolution, but with erosion. In this final section of the story, we explore how the ink tax and its related duties were eventually dismantled, not by dramatic vote or protest, but by changing values, cost-benefit analysis, and a new relationship between the state and the written word. We close with the long-term consequences of taxing communication and what they tell us about power, resistance, and resilience. The practical end of the ink tax. By the early 19th century, the ink tax had become more trouble than revenue. Smuggling was widespread. Enforcement costs had ballooned. Record-keeping around ink production was so convoluted that inspectors could no longer trace batches or calculate accurate dues. Government debates took on a pragmatic tone. Why continue a tax that cannot be collected efficiently? Why punish an industry that underpins every department of the state? Why risk further unrest, especially in an age of expanding literacy? It was the age of reform. In Parliament, utilitarian thinking was replacing older notions of aristocratic control. If a tax interfered with education, trade, or civil service, it was no longer seen as tolerable. And so, without fanfare, the ink tax was gradually phased out. There was no parade, no public notice, no royal speech. The silence of its repeal echoed the quietness of its revolt. Paper, print, and the people. The removal of the ink tax coincided with another great change, the rise of the printed word as a mass medium. By the 1830s, newspapers were expanding in circulation. Penny novels and serialized stories became popular. Public education was on the horizon. Parliamentary records were more accessible. Letter writing flourished across social classes. The written word, once a tool of officials and elites, was now entering the hands of ordinary people. Ink, no longer taxed, flowed more freely, and the democratization of writing began in earnest. In this new environment, it became clear just how much the ink tax had suppressed not in direct censorship, but in opportunity cost. How many letters were never written? How many contracts delayed? How many students left untrained in script? The cost was not just economic. It was generational. The legacy in education. One of the most profound effects of removing writing material taxes was felt in the classroom. Before repeal, rural schools struggled to afford ink and paper. Instructors reused materials or relied on slate and chalk. Writing, as a skill, lagged behind reading. After repeal, literacy rates improved slowly but steadily. Penmanship became a formal part of the curriculum. More children gained access to personal notebooks. Correspondence among lower and middle classes increased. We often imagine revolutions in education arriving with great pedagogical reform or charismatic teachers. But sometimes, it starts with something simpler. Affordable ink. A note on gender and ink. For women, the end of writing material taxation brought a quiet liberation. In the 18th century, female literacy had been growing, but access to writing tools was restricted by both cost and custom. Post-repeal, more women kept personal diaries, wrote letters to friends, family, and suitors, produced poetry and stories, sometimes published anonymously, participated in religious and political discussion by pamphlet. Their voices were not new, but they were newly preserved, thanks to cheaper and more available tools. The ink tax had inadvertently muted a generation of women. Its removal gave their words a page. The strange survival of the stamp duty. While the ink tax faded, the stamp duty, a parallel and more infamous tax, persisted well into the 19th century, especially for newspapers. This duty imposed levies on every copy printed, effectively making newspapers too expensive for the working poor. Reformers called it a tax on knowledge. Only after persistent pressure via petitions, underground presses, and economic arguments was it finally repealed in 1855. This serves as a reminder that not all communication taxes die quickly. Some survive because they benefit those in power, and others are simply forgotten until someone notices the silence they create. Ink and Empire, a final irony. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the British Empire, famed for its bureaucratic precision, nearly choked itself by taxing the tools of its own record-keeping. The empire depended on ink to write orders, keep records, stamp passports, and sign treaties. It needed contracts, port logs, and postal receipts. And yet, for decades, it taxed the very materials that made this communication possible. This tension between control and capacity echoes through the history of bureaucracies. The ink tax serves as a case study in how states, in their search for revenue, sometimes undermine their own functioning. The lesson: even the most mundane tools, quills, ink, paper, can become sites of resistance, negotiation, and change. The ghosts in the margins. Today, the ink tax is mostly forgotten. Few museums house the receipts. No holidays mark its repeal, but its residue lingers in archives and second-hand bookstores, in faded letters from sons to mothers, in scratched school notebooks with reused pages, in business ledgers where expenses for ink are carefully recorded, in anonymous pamphlets that dared to question power. History, we often think, is written in blood and fire. But sometimes it's written in brown ink on worn paper, with a taxed pen by someone too tired to protest, but too stubborn to stop writing. A final blot on the page. As you lie back and let this story settle, consider the last drop of ink in a nearly dry pot. Think of the countless clerks who stretched that drop across a page. Think of the mothers who taught their children to write on scraps of tax paper. Think of the smudged poems, the underpaid scribes, the schoolchildren with second-hand quills. And then ask, what happens to a society when even expression carries a price tag? And more curiously, what might be lost not in fire, but in the quiet decisions never written down, because the ink was simply too expensive? Story 4. A grain too far, the Byzantine Empire's bread subsidy dilemma. You awaken in Constantinople, not amidst mosaic tiles and divine chants, but in the shadow of a granary. The year is somewhere in the 9th century. The air smells of damp grain, salt water from the Golden Horn, and yeast. You are standing near the Horia Theodosiana, the imperial granary system tasked with supplying the city's most vital resource: not gold, not silk, not incense, but bread. Because here in the Byzantine Empire, as in ancient Rome before it, bread is not just food. It is an imperial guarantee. and guaranteeing bread at a regulated price, every day, for 1 million mouths requires a system so complex, so heavy, and so politically fragile that even the most minor disruption might bring the entire order crashing down. This is the story of the Byzantine bread subsidy, a quiet but profound engine of imperial legitimacy, and a logistical nightmare so essential, the empire could not live without it, yet barely managed to sustain it. The grain dole's deep roots. To understand the Byzantine bread subsidy, we must return to its Roman origins. The annona, the public grain distribution, began in the Roman Republic and grew massively under the emperors. By the late empire, free or subsidized grain was distributed to hundreds of thousands in Rome. When the empire split and Rome's importance declined, Constantinople inherited more than architecture and aristocracy. It inherited obligations. Chief among them, keep the people fed. The citizens of Constantinople expected their daily ration of bread, known colloquially as ardos tou demu, bread of the people. It was a civic right, tied not to wealth but to citizenship. This expectation persisted for centuries, adapting in scale and scope, but never fully disappearing. And with every loaf baked, the empire bought a little more time. How the system worked when it did. Let us walk through the Byzantine grain-to-bread pipeline. Grain sourcing. The empire's grain was mostly imported from the fertile provinces Egypt, before it was lost, Thrace, and parts of Asia Minor. Taxes were often paid in kind, meaning landowners owed wheat rather than coins. Shipping and storage. Grain was shipped into Constantinople via merchant vessels, then unloaded at imperial docks and deposited in a series of Horea granaries that could hold thousands of tons. Some were state-owned, others contracted by private families under strict oversight. Milling. The grain was milled into flour using watermills along the Lycus River and smaller mills inside the city. Some mills were run by the state, others by private guilds bound by price and quality regulations. Baking. The flour was distributed to bakeries, both public and private, which were required by law to bake and sell bread at a fixed price. The state dictated the loaf size, grain type, and sale cost. Distribution. Bread was sold in local markets or distributed freely to the urban poor during times of political instability or natural disaster. In theory, the system ran with clockwork precision. In reality, the system ran on delay, bribes, and paperwork. The role of the praefectus annoni and the urban prefect. Overseeing this vast mechanism was the urban prefect, a powerful bureaucratic position dating back to the Roman world. His job was part police, part administrator, part emergency manager. He coordinated grain shipments, resolved bakery disputes, punished price gouging, and ensured quotas were met. Below him were tax agents, grain clerks, mill inspectors, bakery monitors, and a sea of scribes documenting each bushel and loaf. Their tools: wax tablets, seals, weighted scales, and threats of fine or exile. Yet, as with many bureaucratic systems, what looked precise on paper was often negotiable in practice. The baker's burden. Being a state-recognized baker in Constantinople was a double-edged sword. On one hand, bakers received access to state grain and protection from price competition. On the other, they were bound by strict quotas. Failure to meet your quota could mean loss of license, confiscation of tools, public shamming, imprisonment for repeat offenses. Bakers complained quietly that their costs exceeded profits. Fuel was expensive, labor unreliable, regulations inflexible. In times of famine or siege, they were expected to keep baking, even if they had to buy overpriced black market grain. Some quit, others cheated. Many survived by watering down dough, shrinking loaves, or bribing inspectors. It was, quite literally, a daily balancing act between hunger and prison. Bread as political insurance. For Byzantine emperors, the bread subsidy was more than social welfare. It was a contract, a tacit agreement that the empire would provide sustenance in exchange for loyalty. And it worked. When the system ran smoothly, bread diffused discontent. Citizens were less likely to riot if their stomachs were full. Grain imports were celebrated in public ceremonies. Bakers were praised in sermons. But when the system failed, riots. In 927 CE, during a wheat shortage exacerbated by military spending and bad harvests, grain prices spiked. Bakeries couldn't meet demand. The poor rioted in the Mise, the city's main thoroughfare, burning market stalls and confronting guards. The emperor, Romanos I Lecapinos, responded not with violence but with a public promise. He reopened the granaries, distributed emergency rations, and dismissed 2 tax officials. It wasn't generosity, it was self-preservation. The Byzantine dilemma. Bread subsidies posed an impossible challenge. Too generous, and the state went bankrupt. Too stingy, and the people revolted. Too rigid, and the system collapsed under changing conditions. Too lenient, and corruption spread unchecked. In times of peace and plenty, the system worked well enough. But the Byzantine Empire was rarely at peace for long. Between wars with Bulgars, Arabs, and internal claimants, the treasury frequently ran dry. Inflation soared. Grain prices fluctuated wildly. Governors hoarded supplies. Shipments were lost or delayed. The bread kept baking, but always just barely. Bread and the soul, religious dimensions. Orthodox Christianity permeated all aspects of Byzantine life, including bread. Loaves were blessed in churches. Public fasts altered bakery operations. Monasteries ran their own mills and bakeries, sometimes providing for entire neighborhoods. Religious officials debated whether bread given during Lent counted toward the imperial quota. During famines, some emperors framed grain shortages as spiritual tests, calling for repentance rather than reform. This frustrated officials who needed resources, not sermons. Still, faith helped maintain social cohesion when bureaucracy faltered. And in monasteries, quiet kitchens, bread was needed, not for profit but for ritual, remembrance, and relief. The first cracks in the oven wall. As the 10th century advanced, the empire began to strain. Egypt, once the breadbasket of Byzantium, was lost to Islamic rule centuries prior. Balkan territories faced instability, disrupting overland grain routes. Corruption grew among middle-tier officials, who siphoned grain for private resale. Urban population growth outpaced food infrastructure. The result was predictable: shortages, inflation, and a growing dependence on emergency imports from less stable provinces. Behind the grandeur of Constantinople, the ovens burned hotter and the books grew redder. And beneath every baked loaf, a question rose like steam. How long could the empire keep its promise of bread? The scent of bread still lingers in the morning air, but it carries with it a new note: smoke. Something is changing in Constantinople. The promise of bread, the empire's most basic guarantee, is fraying. The system once held together by 1,000 ledgers and silent agreements now creaks under new pressures. The bakers are weary. The grain ships are late. The crowd outside the bakery grows more impatient each morning. This section continues the story of Byzantium's bread subsidy system, tracing its evolution and gradual deterioration under the strains of empire, war, and an increasingly fragile bureaucracy. The grain routes tighten. The bread of Constantinople did not grow in Constantinople. It was imported, sometimes from hundreds of miles away. For centuries, Egypt, the old Roman breadbasket, had been the primary source of grain. After its loss to Arab rule in the 7th century, the Byzantine state shifted its supply chain to Asia Minor, Thrace, and sometimes North Africa. These new routes were longer, more exposed, and more dependent on weather, diplomacy, and naval strength. By the 10th century, coastal piracy disrupted shipping lanes. Political instability in grain-producing provinces delayed harvests. Military requisitions frequently diverted grain mid-route. Famine in rural regions led to hoarding and bribery at port cities. In the imperial records, those that survive, we see grain shipments shrinking, stalling, or arriving spoiled. City officials issued frantic letters requesting emergency supplies. In some years, bread quality dropped so dramatically that officials simply ordered more salt and oil to mask the taste. Behind every loaf, there was now a gamble. Fire in the bakeries, literal and figurative. The Byzantine capital was a city of fires. Many buildings were timber-framed, and bakeries filled with ovens, dry flour, and straw baskets were particularly prone to combustion. One fire in 1043 began in a bakery near the Forum of Constantine and spread across several neighborhoods, destroying homes, shops, and grain warehouses. The response was sluggish. Firefighting crews were minimal. Rebuilding efforts were bureaucratically delayed. But the real damage wasn't structural, it was psychological. In the weeks following the fire, the cost of bread spiked. Loaves were cut smaller. People queued for hours. Rumors spread that the urban prefect had diverted emergency grain to the military. Citizens protested, not violently yet but visibly. They gathered at the hippodrome, holding up blackened bread loaves in silence as the emperor passed by during a ceremonial procession. The message was clear: you have failed to feed us. The rise of the black bread market. With official bread prices fixed by imperial decree and grain shortfalls growing, the city's underground market thrived. This black market, centered in alleys near the docks and behind monasteries, offered loaves of mixed grain, cheaper but coarser, sometimes barely edible. Private bakeries producing unregistered loaves at inflated prices. Smuggled grain sold to elite households unwilling to rely on state rations. These loaves were unofficial, illegal, but for many they were the only option. The urban prefect's agents tried to shut down these operations. Punishments ranged from fines to exile. But the problem was systemic. People weren't trying to cheat the empire, they were trying to survive it. And slowly, the line between legal and illegal bread began to blur. Austerity and religious justifications. Facing growing deficits, some emperors attempted to reduce the bread subsidy. This was never announced directly. Instead, quotas were quietly lowered, loaf weights adjusted, public distribution days reduced. To soften the blow, these decisions were sometimes framed in religious terms. Fasting is a virtue, declared Emperor Michael IV during a shortage. Simplicity is holy, said a bishop in a homily, referencing smaller loaves. The soul is not fed by bread alone, wrote an imperial edict during a particularly lean winter. But hunger is not pious. And the people of Constantinople, while deeply religious, knew the difference between a fast and a rationing crisis. The guilds grow restless. By the 11th century, the collegia, the official bakers' guilds, had become powerful. They negotiated supply terms, requested compensation for flour shortages, and occasionally staged slowdowns to protest new regulations. These weren't modern unions, but they had leverage. In one recorded instance, a baker strike in 1062 led to 3 consecutive days without bread in the forum markets. The public panicked. The Emperor Constantine Exdoucas issued a hasty decree. Loaves would remain price-fixed. Guilds would receive direct compensation from the treasury. Tax inspectors would be rotated to prevent undue pressure. It worked temporarily, but it revealed a troubling truth. The system was now dependent not on imperial discipline, but on the patience of the bakers. The fragile faith of the public. For the people of Constantinople, bread was more than a food, it was a symbol of order. The regular rhythm of flour deliveries, baking, and street distribution structured daily life. When the rhythm faltered, so did trust. Chroniclers describe periods of instability, where rumors swept the city like wind. That the emperor had sold the grain stores to fund a palace renovation. That monks were hoarding flour in underground vaults. That the grain imports were cursed by foreign powers. Whether true or not, the persistence of these beliefs shows how deeply the bread system was tied to imperial legitimacy. An empire could survive losing a battle, but a missing loaf was a sign of collapse. The turning point, the Komnenian Compromise. In the late 11th century, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos inherited a broken empire, militarily weakened, economically exhausted, and reeling from decades of mismanagement. His solution: reform the bread subsidy without ending it. Alexios restructured the grain tax system. Instead of collecting raw wheat, the state accepted coin in many regions, then used that coin to purchase grain from more stable suppliers. He reduced the fixed price burden on bakers by allowing seasonal adjustments. He also encouraged wealthy guilds and religious institutions to sponsor public baking during holy festivals, creating a part private, part public safety net. The reforms were controversial. They did not restore the full promise of free or fixed bread, but they kept loaves in the hands of the people. It was no longer a right, it was a negotiated benefit. And for the time being, that was enough. The unbaked question. So here we are. The bread subsidy still exists, but in altered form. The loaves are smaller, the rules looser, the public more skeptical. The empire is learning too late that no promise lasts forever without change. And so we ask, was the Byzantine bread subsidy a noble idea stretched too far, or a necessary illusion the empire couldn't afford to abandon? And when a state ties its legitimacy to daily bread, what happens when the ovens go cold? The ovens still glow in Constantinople, but they glow dimmer now. The bakeries still open each morning, but with fewer loaves. The queues are longer, the bread is thinner, and the whispers behind closed doors are no longer just about hunger, they are about loss. We trace the waning days of Byzantium's bread subsidy, its last flickers of stability, and the ultimate breakdown of a system that had for centuries kept both hunger and revolution at bay. And in that disintegration, we find not just an ending but a warning, and a strange kind of continuity. From stability to spectacle, bread in the final centuries. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the bread subsidy had undergone several reforms and reductions. What had once been a consistent, subsidized, and sometimes free distribution became an irregular offering, often tied to festivals, political events, or religious holidays. During coronations, emperors would distribute free bread across the city. On saints' days, wealthy patrons in monasteries handed out loaves, part charity, part spectacle. After major victories, rare by this period, bread rations were increased briefly to celebrate. The core promise of daily state-supported bread was gone, but its symbolism remained, preserved like the husk of a once living thing. This shift marked a profound transition, from provision to performance. The Latin occupation and the breakdown of bread. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople fell to Western Crusaders. The city was looted, its churches desecrated, and the Latin Empire established atop the smoldering remains of Byzantine governance. This event is often told as a military or religious catastrophe. But for ordinary citizens, the most immediate impact was economic and culinary. The grain stores were emptied, the bakeries closed, the black market vanished, replaced by military rationing controlled by Latin officers who had no interest in continuing Byzantine social contracts like the bread subsidy. The city's population plummeted. Those who remained scrounged for imported grain, often relying on Venetian or Genoese merchants whose prices fluctuated wildly. Bread became a luxury. Hunger became policy. For the first time in centuries, bread was no longer a right. The Paleologan Restoration, a hollow resumption. When the Byzantines retook the city in 1261 under Michael VII Palaiologos, the imperial government attempted to restore order and symbolism. Bread rations were resumed, albeit in a drastically reduced form. A small daily subsidy was reintroduced, primarily for state employees. Ceremonial bread distributions resumed, especially during Lent and Easter. Certain guilds were given privileges in exchange for sponsoring bakery services. But the empire was now a shadow of its former self, its territory limited, its treasury empty, its population reduced. The bread subsidy persisted more as a memory than a mechanism. In sermons, bread was still spoken of as a divine guarantee. In reality, most citizens got their flour through barter, bribes, or private charity. And so the last true bread subsidy of the Roman world limped on, increasingly irrelevant, until it simply stopped. The final loaf. By the time Constantinople fell again, this time permanently to the Ottomans in 1453, the bread system was long defunct. Some bakeries still operated, often attached to monasteries. Grain arrived irregularly by sea. Loaves were sold, not distributed. There were no quotas, no fixed prices, no guarantees. The empire ended not with fire or steel alone, but with hunger. Chroniclers of the final siege describe citizens milling acorns and weeds into flour substitutes. Bread riots weeks before the final breach. The last intact granary emptied and torched to deny supplies to the invaders. It's easy to focus on walls and weapons in these final days, but just as telling is this. The bread was gone before the banners fell. Memory and legacy. Though the Byzantine bread subsidy died, its legacy lived on in subtle ways. Ottoman Istanbul inherited the city's infrastructure, and while it did not replicate the bread dole, it instituted regulated bakeries, grain controls, and price ceilings for basic loaves. The Eastern Orthodox Church, steeped in Byzantine tradition, retained symbolic bread rituals such as the prosphora, a loaf offered during divine liturgy long after the state that created them had vanished. Modern welfare states would, centuries later, return to the idea that basic sustenance was a right not through bread lines, but through food stamps, price subsidies, and social safety nets. The ancient idea remained: a government to be trusted must feed its people. Modern echoes, the politics of bread today. Even now, in cities across the world, the politics of bread continues. In Egypt, bread subsidies are seen as a red line. Efforts to reform them have sparked riots. In Venezuela, bread scarcity became a symbol of state failure, even more than inflation or crime. In France, the price of baguettes is watched not just by bakers, but by politicians. During global crises, like the 2020 pandemic, governments scrambled to ensure the continued flow of basic staples, bread among them. Behind every modern loaf is an ancient dilemma. How do you balance cost, fairness, and necessity when hunger waits at the door? A reflection in the crumbs. As you settle into sleep, consider the quiet work of a Byzantine baker up before dawn, kneading dough with water rationed from a half-frozen cistern, waiting for grain that may not arrive. Hopping the inspector looks the other way. His bread will feed 50 people. It will not be praised. It may be criticized. It may, if weighed incorrectly, bring punishment. And yet he bakes, because in that loaf lies trust, order, and a fragile empire's final claim to legitimacy. So we ask, can an empire fall from hunger not of ambition, but of bread? And more hauntingly, What promises do our own societies make, with every loaf pulled from the oven? Thus ends Story 4, a grain too far, the Byzantine Empire's bread subsidy dilemma. A tale of crusts and crowns, of bureaucracy and baking, of how feeding a city can uphold or undo an entire world. Story 5, medieval meters standardizing measurements in 12th century France. It's a cold morning in 12th century France. You're standing in the center of a muddy market square. A man is selling cloth, fine Flemish wool. He swears it's 2 L's long. You, a local buyer from a neighboring village, nod and measure it with your rod. But your L is not his L. In fact, your L is closer to his arm's length than to his unit of trade. Voices rise. A crowd gathers. There's talk of deception. And that's how a simple transaction becomes a legal dispute, all because no one can agree on how long anything is. This is the story of how medieval France, fragmented, feudal, and fiercely local, struggled to standardize weights and measures. It's a story without great battles or royal coronations. It's a story of ropes, rods, and records, of merchants, monks, and market inspectors. And it may be the most boring and important story in the making of modern Europe. A land of 1,000 measures. In 12th century France, measurements were as diverse as dialects. The very idea of a single yard or pound meant nothing outside of royal towns or abbey walls. Here, what you might find. A foot in Paris could be 32.4 centimeters. In Rouen, it might be 29.8. A mile in Toulouse was not the same as in Tours. Bushels varied by village. Barrels differed depending on whether they held wine, oil, or fish. Why such chaos? Because every fiefdom, abbey, or town had the right to define its own measures. Local lords often minted their own weights and issued their own sticks for cloth or rope. These measurements were often tied to symbolic objects. A rod might be cut to the king's outstretched arm span. A barrel size might be based on a town, founding monk's ale cask. A rope length could derive from the local church nave. It was not science. It was custom, commerce, and confusion. This might seem charming, like a medieval quilt of culture, but for merchants, it was a nightmare. Let's imagine you're a grain trader from Orleans. You've loaded 3 carts of wheat and ride north to Compiègne. You arrive, proud of your supply, and present your goods. But their bushel is 15% larger than yours. Their pound is heavier. The scale at the local market is rigged for their unit system. You lose money not because your grain is bad, but because your measuring world is incompatible with theirs. As trade grew in the High Middle Ages, especially after the revival of towns, these conflicts multiplied. Markets stalled, trust eroded, disputes flourished. Every merchant carried a collection of measuring sticks, weights, and conversion tables, and a healthy dose of skepticism. The church steps in. Where kings were distant and lords were self-interested, the church saw an opportunity and a responsibility. Monasteries, especially in places like Cluny or Saint-Denis, ran large estates and interacted with merchants from multiple regions. To them, the chaos of measurement interfered with God's order. And so, abbeys issued their own standard weights, blessed, and sometimes chained to the wall to prevent tampering. Monastic scribes began copying conversion charts, kept near their scriptoria. Some churches required tithes by weight and insisted on a consistent scale across their lands. It wasn't exactly a system, but it was a start. And for many regions, a holy standard was more trusted than a feudal one. Royal authority wakes up. As kings in France slowly consolidated power, they began to recognize that controlling weights and measures wasn't just practical, it was political. In the early 12th century, King Louis VI, Louis the Fat, took a keen interest in Parisian markets. Reports of fraud and inconsistent measures had reached the court. His response: he ordered the first centralized standard to be kept at the royal palace in Paris. He appointed market wardens to inspect goods and scales. He levied fines for false measures and sometimes punished offenders publicly. These acts were not just about fairness. They were about making the king's presence felt not just in war, but in the marketplace. Soon after, other royal towns followed suit: Bourges, Orleans, Tours. Each issued local standards, each proclaimed them under the king's authority. But a problem remained: those standards often still differed. The inspectors and the iron rods. Across France, a new figure emerged in medieval life: the market inspector. Often working for the town, sometimes for a guild, this official carried a set of calibrated weights, certified by the local authority. A measuring rod, often made of iron, inscribed with the unit length. A small wax seal stamp to mark goods as verified. Inspectors traveled from stall to stall, measuring bolts of cloth, weighing sacks of flour, checking the volume of barrels. If a merchant's tools were off even by a thumb's width, penalties followed. Repeat offenders might be barred from the market or forced to publicly burn their defective scales. The system was imperfect. Inspectors were often bribed, rods bent, weights worn down. Still, the idea took root: trade should happen on shared terms. The pushback of local power. Not everyone welcomed standardization. Local lords viewed measurement as a form of sovereignty. If a king could define a pound, he could define taxation. If the church defined a yard, it might define trade. And so, some lords refused royal standards. Others issued anti-royal rods, insisting their market followed ancestral units. Guilds, especially in cities like Lyon, argued that local customs served them better. These tensions turned standardization into a quiet battleground. Not one of swords, but of scales, sticks, and scribes. The ordinary person and the impossible math. Amid this bureaucratic chaos, the common person, the miller, the midwife, the mason, was caught in confusion. You might buy fabric measured by the town rod, then pay tax in royal feet, and donate to the church by monastic weight. In some villages, there were conversion stones in public squares, literally carved with ratios to help people navigate the math. Yet even then, errors were common, overpayment frequent, fraud almost expected. In a ledger from a merchant guild in Tours, one entry reads: sold 3 barrels of salt, disputed, local measure not matching buyer, resolved, half a bushel gifted to close mouth. This was medieval diplomacy, one measure at a time. A world waiting for the metric system. Of course, this story doesn't end in the 12th century. France would wrestle with measurements for another 600 years, until the French Revolution and the birth of the metric system finally imposed true standardization. But the seeds were here. In every clumsy rod, in every overfilled barrel, in every merchant who cursed a foreign L. This was not about units. It was about trust. A quiet question at the market stall. So, as you watch the cloth seller in the village square argue with his buyer, and an inspector squint at a rod marked with fading ink, you begin to wonder: can a society thrive if its people can't agree on what a pound means? And more curiously, what happens to trust when even the length of a loaf, or the weight of a coin, depends on where you are standing? It's a generation later. A new century is turning. The rod still rules the market, but now there's talk of something different: a royal yard. A standardized, official, certified measure that could travel with merchants from one end of France to the other without raising suspicion, dispute, or a magistrate's fee. It sounds like progress. But in a society still defined by custom, not consistency, that progress will come slowly and not without resistance. This section explores how royal authority, merchant networks and urban guilds pushed toward a standardized system of weights and measures in medieval France, and how that transformation reshaped markets, laws, and everyday life. It is a story told through edicts, compromises, and long arguments over rope lengths and flour sacks. Because sometimes, civilization advances by half an inch at a time. Royal power grows, and so does its need for standards. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the French crown was growing in strength. Kings like Philip II Augustus expanded royal holdings, subdued rebellious vassals, and centralized administration from the Louvre's emerging bureaucracy. With this expansion came a need for order not just in law and landholding, but in the daily transactions that made royal cities wealthy and sustainable. For kings, measurement was not just about trade, it was about control. Accurate measures meant predictable tax revenue. Standardized weights simplified military provisioning. Consistent systems allowed for better market regulation and price stability. In a royal edict from 1190, Philip Augustus declared that markets in Paris were to use crown-approved measures. These standards were cast in iron and kept in public places, some embedded in church walls or town halls, others chained to posts in open squares. For the first time, the common people could compare a merchant's measure to a public reference. Fraud was still possible, but no longer so easy. The rise of sealed measures. With public standards came a new form of authority, the seal. Royal and municipal governments began issuing official measuring tools. Weights marked with stamped metal insignia. Rods etched with the fleur-de-lis or town sigils. Cups, bushels, and barrels sealed with wax or lead to indicate verification. A merchant using unsealed measures risked fines, confiscation of goods, or even expulsion from the market. These seals became a visual language of legitimacy. A buyer no longer needed to trust the merchant, they could trust the mark. This development wasn't just regulatory, it was psychological. It shifted the burden of honesty from the individual to the system. For medieval society, long ruled by oaths and personal reputation, this was a profound shift toward institutional trust. Guilds and the politics of precision. While the crown led the charge for standardization, it often worked through and occasionally against the powerful urban guilds. Guilds were professional associations of craftsmen and merchants. They regulated training, pricing, product quality, and increasingly measurement standards. In cities like Lyon, Bordeaux, and Toulouse, guilds issued their own measuring rods and enforced their use within their walls. Some guilds even established internal courts to resolve disputes over weight and volume. Guild control had both benefits and problems. Benefits: standardization within guild territories improved trust. Guilds ensured members followed rules under threat of expulsion. They often supported crown efforts to align their units with royal ones. Problems: guilds resisted external oversight, especially from royal inspectors. Some refused to adopt crown measures, arguing local units served better. Guilds sometimes manipulated standards to favor members over outsiders. In short, guilds became both enforcers and obstacles to the kingdom's dream of a unified measuring system. Crossroads of conversion, medieval math in action. With growing royal and guild-imposed standards, merchants faced a new challenge: conversion. A cloth trader traveling from Paris to Avignon needed to navigate 3 or 4 local measurement systems. Enter the conversion table copied by hand into merchant ledgers or referenced in communal guild books. Some examples: 1 Paris L equals 1.15 Rouen Ls. 1 Toulouse pound approximately 0.92 Bourges pound. 1 Poitiers foot equals 11.7 inches. Yes, theirs was shorter than average. A skilled merchant became part linguist, part mathematician. Many markets posted conversion stones, flat slabs etched with comparative figures. Still, errors were common. A misconverted bolt of cloth could cost a weaver a week's wages. A tax based on the wrong bushel might cause riots. A foreign merchant misjudging wine barrel sizes could ruin a shipment's value. Every transaction became a negotiation of math and mutual understanding. Measurement as social symbol. In this age, a measure wasn't just a tool, it was a social signifier. To own a crown-sealed rod signaled that you operated under royal protection. To use guild-certified weights showed that you were part of a respected craft. To trade in customary units marked you as local and possibly resistant to outside authority. In some cases, merchants would display their measuring tools prominently in stalls, even if not in use. A polished bronze weight, a neatly painted wooden rod, these were not just practical implements, but badges of identity and legitimacy. Measurement became a visible language, and like any language, it could include or exclude. Resistance and rural realities. While urban centers moved toward standardization, the countryside lagged behind. In rural France, measurement remained local, oral, and fluid. A field might be measured by how long it took to plow. A gallon might be defined by the local alewife's jug. A cord of firewood was sometimes as high as a man's shoulder. Attempts to impose crown standards met with confusion or defiance. Rural folk were less concerned with aligning to Parisian units than with surviving winter. A chronicler near Limoges records, "When the king's rod came, we set it by the priest's door, but the grain still filled the same sacks, and the rope still stretched the same distance." Standardization here was less a transformation than a distant rumor toward a fragile uniformity. By the end of the 13th century, France had made major strides. Royal towns had public standards. Guilds cooperated in key cities. Crown seals were common in urban markets. Merchants carried conversion charts. Markets increasingly spoke a shared measuring language. Yet beneath this surface, disunity remained. Local units still thrived in smaller towns and countryside. Conversion errors caused friction. Measurement reforms often needed to be reissued by successive kings. Trust remained partial, always subject to revision. This wasn't yet a standardized nation, but it was a standardized aspiration. An open ledger. So the merchant packs his wares again. He checks his seals, aligns his weights, and tucks his conversion table into his satchel. The next town uses a different L, but he's ready. The road ahead is uncertain, but the numbers are clearer than ever before. Still, one question remains. Can a kingdom ever truly unite its people if every market speaks a different measuring tongue? And more curiously, what do we lose when we finally agree on what a yard means? A tradition, a freedom, or just the confusion? In the bustling cities and muddy lanes of medieval France, the measuring stick never truly rested. Merchants and millers still argued over feet and fists. Inspectors still squinted at worn bushels. Guild members still swore by the yardsticks passed down from their masters. And yet, even amidst this stubborn variety, a quiet momentum was building, a slow drift toward uniformity, born not of decree alone, but of exhaustion. We examine the legacy of France's medieval efforts to standardize measurement. We'll trace how early steps evolved, sometimes backward over centuries, and how the persistence of confusion eventually gave way to revolution. But more importantly, we'll reflect on how this seemingly dull campaign to define a pound or a foot was nothing less than a campaign to define reality. The fragmented map of measures. By the 14th and 15th centuries, France had dozens, possibly hundreds, of coexisting measurement systems. Here's a glimpse. Over 250 different units of length were in use across French towns. Weights varied between trade goods. one liver for cheese, another for wool. Even time could be measured differently. Some regions counted the day from sunrise, others from midnight. Barrel sizes could vary by river valley, not just region. Every reform, every edict, every set of royal standards helped, but none eliminated the variations. Because measuring was not just a matter of utility. It was a matter of identity. When measures meant sovereignty. In the late medieval period, measurement was deeply entwined with jurisdiction. A town's right to define its own ell was part of its chartered freedoms. A lord's right to impose a tax often required defining the unit in which it was paid. Monasteries claimed ancient privileges to measure by saint-blessed rods. Urban guilds protected their standards like relics. To remove these units was to erase local power. That's why even kings, powerful as they were, moved carefully. They issued parallel standards, not replacements. They allowed equivalents, not abolitions. Uniformity could not be imposed by fiat, not yet. Instead, pluralism persisted, with mutual translation as the only piece. Printing and the paper trail. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century added a surprising accelerant to the push for standardization. For the first time, merchants and magistrates across France could share printed conversion tables, compare royal decrees side by side, read identical merchant guides that standardized procedures. In 1485, a Parisian printer published Livre de la Toise, a slim manual offering standardized comparisons of French and Flemish measuring units. It sold widely, not just to merchants, but to city clerks and tax officials. The more people shared information, the more pressure there was to share definitions. Measurement was becoming portable not just in metal, but in print. The Renaissance of the rod. In the 16th century, royal power and reformist ambition returned to measurement. Kings like Francis I and Henry IV commissioned new surveys of royal holdings. These cadastral surveys required standard rods and weights. Surveyors carried engraved measuring staffs, and royal cartographers insisted on consistent units of distance. Urban planning, land disputes, and taxation all drove renewed attempts at regularization. And yet, despite these efforts, the underlying problem remained. France still didn't speak a single measuring language. A merchant in Marseille, a mayor in Rouen, and a weaver in Dijon still lived in different numerical worlds. Revolution, the turning point. It wasn't until the French Revolution, nearly 600 years after the initial royal reforms, that real, total standardization arrived. Revolutionaries viewed traditional units as symbols of feudalism, tied to privileges, local lords, and opaque systems. The chaos of measurements, they believed, mirrored the injustice of the old regime. And so, in 1795, the National Convention declared a new system. The meter would define all lengths. The kilogram would define weight. The liter would define volume. All units would be decimal-based. All standards would be derived from nature, not kings or saints. It was radical, it was logical, it was boring and brilliant. The metric system was born. But even then, resistance lingered. Many French towns continued using their local units, sometimes secretly, for another generation. The new system didn't erase the old. It waited for them to fade. Legacy and lessons. The story of France's medieval measuring muddle might seem quaint now, but its impact is everywhere. Every meter stick in a classroom. Every recipe measured in grams. Every speed limit posted in kilometers per hour. These are the distant descendants of iron rods in Parisian markets, gilt-sealed weights, and conversion stones carved into village squares. The world's current systems of measurement, used in nearly every country, owe their conceptual ancestry to medieval France's long journey through confusion and compromise. Even more broadly, this story reminds us, measurement is not just math, it's social agreement. And agreement is messy, slow, and hard-won. The weight of agreement. As we return to that imaginary village market one final time, consider this. The measuring rod has changed shape. The standards are now universal. The arguments have faded, but the impulse remains. To count, to compare, to agree. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's necessary. And so we ask, how many quiet revolutions begin not with fire but with a wooden rod held out, and a merchant saying, this is a meter. And even more curiously, what might our own modern measures, gigabytes, carbon credits, social metrics reveal about the world we're still trying to standardize? Story 6. Parchment and Power: How Paperwork Helped the Abbasid Caliphate Govern an Empire. It is early morning in 9th century Baghdad. As the sun climbs over the Tigris River, the first officials step into a quiet stone building, long, windowless, lined with shelves and sealed baskets of scrolls. The air is dry, heavy with dust and ink. There are no swords here, no royal banners or grand parades, yet this is the beating heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. This is the Diwan, the bureaucratic office that keeps the vast empire functioning. Across thousands of miles, from the Maghreb to the borders of China, from the Arabian Sea to the mountains of Armenia, the Abbasids ruled over one of the largest, most diverse empires in the pre-modern world. But they didn't rule by force alone, they ruled by paper. This is the story of how scribes, ledgers, registers, seals, and scrolls shaped the daily operations of a caliphate. It is a quiet story, a tale of taxation and translation, of careful writing and meticulous record-keeping. And yet, it is a story of power, of how authority traveled across deserts and mountains not with warriors, but with words. The administrative challenge of empire. When the Abbasid dynasty overthrew the Umayyads in 750 CE, they inherited not only lands but the task of managing them. Their capital, Baghdad, founded in 762 by Caliph al-Mansur, was envisioned not merely as a seat of religion or military command, but as an administrative brain. The caliphs knew that to rule a fragmented, multi-ethnic, multilingual empire required more than decrees. It required systems. The Abbasids inherited the Diwan structure from the earlier Umayyads, who had borrowed it from Byzantine and Persian bureaucracies. Under the Abbasids, these offices expanded. The Diwan al-Kharaj managed land tax and agricultural revenues. The Diwan al-Barid oversaw the imperial postal and intelligence system. The Diwan al-Jund maintained army payrolls and recruitment rolls. The Diwan al-Rasil handled correspondence and translation. And several local Diwans dealt with provincial records, tax audits, and public works. Together, they formed a web of administrative paper stretching across the empire. The rise of the professional scribe. At the center of this system stood an unlikely figure, the scribe or katib. These were not simple clerks. They were highly trained, literate in Arabic and often in Persian or Greek, familiar with law, poetry, theology, and sometimes even mathematics. A skilled katib could compose elegant official letters in ornate Arabic prose, copy tax registers without error, convert Byzantine financial terms into Abbasid formats, draft contracts enforceable in both the central court and a provincial qadi's office. Training took years. Many scribes came from elite families or were educated in state-sponsored schools. Some were converts to Islam, others were dhimmis, non-Muslims living under Islamic protection, particularly Christians and Jews who had long traditions of administrative work. The profession of the katib became so esteemed that many courtiers and viziers, such as the famous Aleph letter 1E0 DL Ibn Saul, or Ibn al-Muqff letter 2bf, rose from scribe ranks to powerful roles. To be a scribe was to hold the pen of empire. Paper, a revolutionary medium. The Abbasids had another advantage: paper. Unlike earlier empires that used expensive parchment, brittle papyrus, or stone tablets, the Abbasids were among the first to widely adopt paper across state administration. The key moment: around 751 CE, shortly after the Battle of Talas in Central Asia, Chinese papermakers were captured by Abbasid forces. The knowledge of paper-making previously guarded in China spread westward. Soon, paper mills appeared in Samarkand, Baghdad, and Damascus. The Abbasid state, always eager to save costs and improve efficiency, embraced this new medium. Paper was cheaper than parchment. It was easier to store, copy, and transport. It supported quill and ink, ideal for Arabic script. It could be mass-produced, allowing for administrative scale never seen before. Suddenly, the caliphate could support real record-keeping, archiving tax rolls, copying decrees, maintaining property surveys, and issuing receipts, all on thin, flexible sheets stored in cedar boxes or rolled into scrolls. Paper transformed governance. How taxation worked and why it needed paper. Consider the tax system under the Abbasids. The caliphate relied heavily on land revenue, especially from fertile areas like the Sawad in Iraq and the Nile Delta in Egypt. But to collect taxes properly, the state needed accurate surveys of arable land, registers of landowners and tenant farmers, records of exemptions, often granted to mosques or scholars, correspondence with local governors and assessors, periodic audits, and double entry bookkeeping. A farmer in Khurasan might pay a portion of his barley harvest in kind, while a merchant in Basra paid a commercial tax in coin. All of this needed to be calculated, recorded, and traceable, often across hundreds of miles. Mistakes could mean revolts. Paper allowed tax collectors to issue receipts, which citizens could present if falsely taxed again. It allowed local governors to send reports to Baghdad for cross-checking, and it allowed the caliph's court to reassign revenue districts with knowledge in hand. Without paper and the scribes to manage it, the system would collapse. The secret system, the Barid. One of the more remarkable uses of paper was in the Diwan al-Barid, the postal service. This wasn't just for letters. The Barid served as an intelligence network. Relay stations were established every 12-15 miles along major roads. Couriers, often on horseback, carried dispatches sealed with wax or string, marked with the insignia of their office. They moved tax data, military updates, provincial complaints, and spy reports. Each stop logged the document, stamped the time of arrival, and passed it forward. In Baghdad, a team of scribes read, copied, and archived the reports. This system allowed the caliph to know of unrest in Egypt before it reached crisis, track a wandering provincial governor's expenses, respond to requests for grain during a famine. Through paper, the caliph saw across deserts. What was in a scroll? We imagine scrolls as ancient relics, but in Abbasid times they were living tools. A scroll might contain a provincial tax ledger listing crops, water use, and census data, a report on troop morale during a campaign against Byzantines, a letter from the caliph to a local qadi clarifying a legal ambiguity, a budget breakdown for rebuilding a mosque's water system. Each scroll was copied carefully, annotated in the margins, sometimes tagged with red ink or gold leaf for emphasis. Important scrolls were stored in sacks or caskets, labeled with wax seals, and sometimes given poetic names. The clarity of revenue, or the star of legal ruling. These weren't just dry bureaucratic files, they were artifacts of statecraft. The fragility beneath the order. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Abbasid administrative systems were not immune to collapse. Wars destroyed records. Scribes were bribed or falsified data. Tax collectors went rogue. Governors burned documents to erase debts. In 861, after the assassination of Caliph al-Mutawakkil, the empire entered a period known as the Anarchy at Samarra, one of the first signs of breakdown. The paper trail stopped. Revenues became unpredictable. Provinces stopped reporting. Military payrolls vanished into thin air, and the caliph, unable to see his empire, lost control. The pen was powerful, but power depends on continuity. The paper and the people. It's easy to think that paperwork only affected the elite, but over time, it touched everyone. A farmer's tax receipt could protect him from double taxation. A merchant's commercial license could earn him guild protection. A scholar's inheritance rights were proven by notarized documents. A soldier's widow could claim his pension through payroll records. In an empire of many tongues and traditions, paperwork provided a common structure, a shared logic. It was dull but democratic. Even if most people couldn't read the Arabic script, they knew that paper could defend them or damn them. The scroll that survives. Somewhere buried in the sands of Syria or stored in a forgotten library in Cairo is a scroll, faded ink, cracking edges. A small wax seal may be intact. It does not contain a miracle. It does not proclaim a caliph's glory. It merely says, 10 sheep, 1 man, Sawad district, harvest taxed 9th year of Al-Mamun. But in that simple record is the entire idea of empire. Because power to last must be written down. The scroll is now unrolled before the Qadi. It is quiet in the courtroom, only the gentle scratching of a reed pen and the flickering of oil lamps overhead. The caliph's seal gleams faintly. A line of script confirms it. The widow's claim is legitimate. Justice will be done. In the Abbasid Caliphate, paperwork was not just an economic or logistical tool. It became the instrument of justice, a way to navigate the tangle of taxes, debts, marriages, and disputes that define daily life. As bureaucracy expanded, the empire witnessed the birth of a document-based society, one where a person's fate could hinge on a single piece of parchment or a signature from a scribe. This section explores how paperwork underpinned the Abbasid legal system, the intertwining of law and administration, and how writing quiet, mundane, and methodical became the cornerstone of justice in one of the world's most complex empires. Qadis and the power of the pen. The Abbasid Empire operated under a dual system of governance. The Shari Macron letter 2bf of Islamic law derived from the Quran, Hadith, and juristic interpretation. The Siyasa practical governance under the caliph's authority, often more flexible and administrative in nature. Where these overlapped was often in the courtroom, presided over by the Qadi, a judge trained in Islamic jurisprudence, but also intimately familiar with bureaucratic procedure. The Qadi's decisions weren't based on instinct. They were grounded in evidence, and that increasingly meant documents. Marriage contracts, tax receipts, land ownership deeds, business partnerships, criminal complaints, witness depositions. These records weren't always elaborate. Some were written on scrap paper or cloth, but they had to be legible, authenticated, and most importantly, archivable. A judge might examine a 2-year-old debt register to rule on an unpaid loan, or consult a governor's decree on irrigation rights when settling a village dispute. Paper became a silent witness, one that could outlive any living testimony. Notaries and the rise of civil documentation. Just as judges needed proof, citizens needed professionals to produce it. Enter the SHUR letter 1E60 of scribes and notaries, letter 2BFUDU Macron L. Public officials and semi-independent writers authorized to draft, witness, and record civil transactions. Want to sell your house? You needed a sales contract signed by 2 male witnesses and, ideally, a notary. Want a divorce? A written declaration with clear mention of dowry return and custody rights. Starting a trade partnership. A detailed mudaraba contract, one investing capital, the other labor with terms for profit sharing. These records were often copied in triplicate, one for each party and one retained at the local diwan or mosque archive. A dispute might arise 5 years later and the document would resurface creased, smudged, but decisive. In this way, even ordinary people, bakers, blacksmiths, camel drivers, learned that their lives could be secured on paper. It wasn't always fair. Literacy was still a privilege. Fraud was still possible, but the ideal was clear. A society governed by proof. Women, contracts, and protection through paper. While medieval law generally favored men in inheritance and testimony, Abbasid-era paperwork offered surprising avenues for women's autonomy, especially among the urban classes. Women could own and manage property, documented in notarized deeds. They could sue for unpaid dowries, with copies of their marriage contracts. Wealthy women even established charitable endowments, waqf, preserving assets in perpetuity for religious or public purposes. Some court records show widows using contracts to protect their children's inheritance or to prevent forced remarriage. In rare cases, women acted as witnesses, particularly if the parties involved were also women. Documents became tools of agency, even in a male-dominated society. One widow from Basra reportedly carried a folded tax receipt in her sleeve for years, presenting it in court when a local official attempted to reclaim her property. The receipt, ink faded but still legible, won the case. The secretarial elite viziers, bureau chiefs, and the inner circle. High above the local courts and notaries sat the secretarial elite viziers, bureau heads, and royal scribes whose decisions shaped the lives of millions. The most famous of these was Ibn al-Muqff letter 2BF, a Persian convert who served under Caliph al-Mansur. His writings, especially the treatise Adab al-Khatib, the etiquette of the scribe, set the tone for generations of bureaucrats. To be a scribe in the Abbasid chancery meant mastery of secretarial Arabic, a refined, often poetic prose style. Familiarity with regional dialects and foreign terms. An ability to craft legal ambiguity or precision, depending on need. Absolute loyalty to the vizier or caliph you served. These elite scribes controlled the official record. A command recorded by a vizier could redirect a river, pardon a criminal, or launch a campaign. One legendary anecdote recounts how a scribe once saved a province by subtly altering a single line in a tax order, changing levy to be doubled into levy to be delayed. When power is written, even a stroke of the pen can change the course of history. Archives and memory. Paper meant permanence, but where was it all kept? Abbasid archives ranged from simple scroll baskets to elaborately catalogued chests known as letter 1E63 a Macron DIQ. Major diwans maintained their own repositories, often guarded by eunuchs or trusted scribes. Some palatial archives had index clerks who memorized entire catalog systems, rotating file systems with leather tags or reed labels, scroll racks organized by province, date, and category, emergency evacuation plans in case of fire or rebellion. Sadly, few original archives have survived. Fires, wars, and the passage of time claimed most of them, but fragments remain: parchments discovered in Geniza repositories in Cairo, stray scrolls from provincial caches, and literary references in biographies and treatises. They tell us what was valued. Not just the grand proclamations, but the tax rolls, birth registries, contracts, and censuses. The boring documents on which the empire truly rested. When paper failed, no system is perfect. Even the Abbasids, with their legendary administration, faced collapse. In times of crisis, civil war, famine, Mongol raids, paper could not feed the hungry or stop the sword. Corruption within diwans meant forged documents and false audits. Rival scribes might produce competing decrees, each bearing official seals. Governors occasionally burned paperwork to erase debt or dodge accountability. And sometimes the problem was simpler still: decay. Heat, humidity. Insects. An empire built on paper needed constant rewriting, copying, and care. Even so, many still believed. A kingdom without ink is a kingdom without memory. The silent revolution. What emerges from this dusty world of ledgers and seals is something remarkable. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate had built what we might call the first archival empire. It didn't rely solely on charisma, piety, or conquest. It relied on durable records, codified processes, scribes who understood systems, not just symbols. In other words, the Abbasids pioneered an idea we take for granted today. That power isn't just exercised, it is documented, replicated, and filed. The court session ends. The widow leaves with a sealed document in her hand. Another day, another piece of paper added to the endless scroll of history. And yet we are left with a question. If the pen once ruled an empire, what happens when the ink dries, and no one remembers how to read the script? Somewhere near the river, an old scribe quietly rolls a scroll shut. The ink is dry. The seal, still intact, bears the mark of a caliph no one obeys anymore. The record is perfect, but the world around it is falling apart. By the 11th century, the Abbasid Caliphate, once the most administratively sophisticated power in the world, was beginning to crumble. Paperwork had once held the empire together, building bridges of information, legality, and control. But slowly, those bridges began to rot. This final section examines how the delicate machinery of Abbasid administration, its scrolls, scribes, ledgers, and law, began to unravel. As political power weakened, so too did the power of paper. We will explore what happens when a bureaucracy outlives the empire it was built to serve. And we'll ask the quiet but important question: what remains when the scroll is no longer read? The limits of the ledger. In its prime, the Abbasid state was defined by bureaucratic clarity. Taxes were counted, disputes recorded, letters filed. But this system had limits. First, scale. The empire stretched across a vast geography, with hundreds of local governors, tribal leaders, and regional officials. Even with paper and postal services, information could take weeks, sometimes months, to reach the capital. As provincial power grew, many governors began ignoring Baghdad's scrolls. They stopped sending updates. They kept tax revenue. They hired their own scribes and produced local paperwork, often incompatible with the central system. By the 10th century, the caliphate had begun to decentralize into a patchwork of semi-independent states. The Chelunids and Ikhshadids in Egypt, the Buyids in Persia, the Hamdanids in Syria, the Samanids in Transoxiana. Each maintained their own bureaucracy, inspired by Abbasid systems but no longer loyal to the caliph. The central administration in Baghdad continued writing, but fewer and fewer were listening. Scribes without a center. As power fragmented, the status of scribes began to change. Once prestigious court officials, many scribes found themselves without patrons. Some fled to provincial courts. Others shifted into private service, drafting legal documents for local elites, merchants, and religious institutions. A few turned to scholarship, copying texts and translating works of science and philosophy. Some preserved law codes and treatises, unknowingly safeguarding the intellectual heritage of the caliphate. And yet, the infrastructure of centralized paperwork diwan's with index systems, tax archives, sealed reports became increasingly obsolete. In some cities, entire archives were abandoned or lost during factional violence. Earthquakes, fires, and floods destroyed paper stores. More often, it was neglect. The ink faded, the reed bindings broke, and the scrolls became meaningless. A report on canal maintenance from 902 CE meant little when the canal no longer existed. Corruption, redundancy, and bureaucratic paralysis. As central oversight waned, bureaucracy began to eat itself. Some scribes created multiple registers for the same tax, offering the most favorable one to whoever paid the best bribe. Governors forged decrees, often using seals stolen or copied from retired officials. Tax collectors issued receipts, then claimed they were forged, demanding payment again. Appeals were lost in labyrinthine filing systems, either by accident or intent. An empire once admired for its paper efficiency became bloated with contradictions. By the late 10th century, certain offices had become functionally paralyzed. The Diwan al-Jund, once responsible for paying troops, often sent salaries months late if at all because no one knew which soldiers were actually alive or active. Paper was no longer a source of order. It was a shield for corruption, a maze of meaningless formality. Paper as memory, paper as myth. And yet, even as bureaucracy failed in practice, it gained power in another way, as myth. Writers in the 11th and 12th centuries began to romanticize the Abbasid system of old. They praised the elegance of its scrolls, the precision of its tax audits, the reasoned decisions of its qadis. The very collapse of the system seemed to elevate its memory. Travelers like al-Muqaddasi and scholars like al-Ghazali referenced the old bureaucratic forms with reverence. They compared their own chaotic times to the golden clarity of the earlier diwans. Some even recreated paperwork forgeries of lost documents to claim legitimacy for new rulers or legal decisions. In the end, the bureaucracy outlived its function. It became a symbol, a lost model of justice and order that newer states like the Seljuks, Ayyubids, and later the Ottomans tried to imitate. The Mongols and the fire. Then came the final blow. In 1258, Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad. The city's libraries, archives, and mosques repositories of centuries of paper were burned, looted, or thrown into the Tigris River. Eyewitnesses claimed the river ran black with ink. Of course, not all the archives had survived up to that point. Much had already decayed or been lost, but the Mongol sack was a symbolic end. The scrolls of the caliphate were physically destroyed, their wax seals melted, their delicate reed ties snapped. It was not just the end of an empire, it was the end of a world built on paper. Echoes in the modern bureaucratic world. And yet, the Abbasid legacy lives on not in armies, but in administrative systems still used today. The Ottoman defter system of tax registration directly descended from Abbasid diwans. Modern Arabic legal and fiscal terminology often echoes Abbasid usage. The very idea of a government based on writing, on records, contracts, and ledgers rather than brute power was deeply shaped by this caliphate of scribes. Even today, in offices and ministries from Cairo to Baghdad, paper forms circulate stamped and filed, echoes of a world where paper once ruled. And historians, leafing through old manuscripts in dusty archives, still find traces of that order registers of barley sales, complaints from merchants, tax lists annotated by tired scribes. Each scroll is a window into a world where ink was power. Final reflection, the fragility of recorded power. The Abbasid experiment teaches us a quiet truth. Power written is power remembered, but it is also power that can fade. A world run on paper is elegant, flexible, and efficient, but also deeply fragile. It depends on preservation, on literacy, on careful copying and good faith. When those vanish, even the most perfect bureaucracy becomes a graveyard of paper. So we ask, what systems today depend on memory stored in fragile forms? What happens if, centuries from now, no one can read the files? Or worse, no one cares to? And with that, the scroll closes.